The briefing had been thorough. This was Advisor Tor's consistent quality: thorough, specific, delivered with the patient efficiency of someone who had been preparing commission representatives for formal court appearances for 11 years, and who had developed, across those 11 years, the ability to compress the essential content into exactly the time available without losing anything that would later prove to have been necessary. Davenrel had listened with the full attention he brought to all briefings, which was the full attention of someone who understood that briefings were the material of which professional errors were made when they were received insufficiently. He had asked 3 clarifying questions. He had received 3 thorough answers. He had thanked Advisor Tor and had reviewed his notes on the transit to Sorveth-Oren, and had arrived at the Commission's preparation suite with the material organized in the order it would be needed. The preparation suite was a functional room on the court's administrative level, provided for the diplomatic corps pre-session preparation, and it had the quality of institutional hospitality at its most professionally adequate, sufficient, and impersonal in equal measure, designed for use rather than for comfort, which was the correct design for a room whose purpose was the final preparation before a session, rather than the accommodation of its occupants' preferences. He spread the session's documentation across the preparation surface and reviewed it in the sequence that the session's agenda produced: the Eastern Corridor Monitoring Expansion Proposal, the technical appendices, the Commission's position documentation, and the bilateral framework provisions that established the Commission's formal right to contribute to strategic sessions concerning the joint territories. He had read all of this before the briefing, and he read it again now, because the second reading was where the things the first reading had flagged as interesting either confirmed their significance or revealed that the interest was a misread, and he needed to know which. The things he had flagged in the first reading confirmed their significance in the second. The Eastern Corridor Monitoring Expansion was, in the formal documentation, a straightforwardly positive proposal: expanded coverage of a critical corridor zone, infrastructure improvements that would modernize the monitoring architecture, and a timeline that was, the proposal's language said, ambitious and achievable with coordinated effort, optimistic. The technical appendix, which had the specific character of technical documents produced by people who were required to be accurate, and who were also operating in an environment where the accuracy had implications that the institutional context found inconvenient, contained the constraint buried in the subsurface array configuration specifications. The constraint was not hidden exactly. It was documented in the technical register of someone who was putting it in the record because it was real and because the record needed to be accurate. It was simply in the language that technical specifications used, which was the language of precise qualification rather than the language of clear implication, and which required someone who was reading for implication rather than for specification to identify it as the load-bearing element it was. The constraint was this: the Eastern Corridor's subsurface monitoring arrays, in the proposed configuration, required a sequential installation calibration that the proposed timeline's operational schedule compressed into a window that was technically insufficient for the calibration to be completed correctly. The insufficiency was documented in the technical appendix's footnote 23, which read, "Calibration protocol requires minimum 14 standard day sequencing per array tier. Proposed schedule accommodates 9-day sequencing. Variance from minimum protocol, 5 standard days per tier, 3 tiers affected. Total calibration shortfall, 15 standard days. Impact assessment, pending operational review." Pending operational review was the specific language of a technical document that had identified a problem, and that had flagged it correctly, and that had then placed the consequences in the category of someone else's assessment, because the technical document's responsibility was to the technical facts, and the consequences were a different category's responsibility. The monitoring gap that the 15 standard day calibration shortfall would produce was in the Eastern Corridor's subsector 4, the section of the corridor that the Commission's own records, which Davin had been reviewing for 6 months, documented as the highest-risk zone for bilateral relationship incidents in the past decade. 7 of the 10 significant incidents that the Commission's incident log contained had originated in or passed through Subsector 4. The monitoring infrastructure's gap in that subsector during the expansion's calibration period would create a 15-day window in which the monitoring capability that had been the primary early warning mechanism for 5 of those 7 incidents would not be operational. He had read this in the first reading and had thought, "This needs to be named." He had read it again in the second reading and thought the same thing, with the specific additional quality of someone who had confirmed that the assessment was correct rather than a first-reading artifact. He was aware that the session's other participants would not have read the technical appendix at the level of footnote 23, because footnote 23 required the specific reading mode of someone who was looking for what the documentation did not want to say clearly, and that reading mode was not the reading mode of the session's formal preparation culture, which read documentation for its formal claims rather than for its qualified implications. He was aware that naming the constraint in the session's formal context would be naming something that none of the session's other participants had named, which was the specific configuration that his 16 years had taught him consistently produced the quality of moment in formal sessions that Advisor Tor's briefing had spent a notable portion of its time preparing him to avoid. He was also aware, with the honest, specific awareness of someone who had spent 16 years learning the lesson, that the comfortable version of strategic analysis was reliably worse than the accurate one, that not naming it was the thing that produced the worst outcomes. The managed version of the assessment, the version that noted the proposal's positive elements and mentioned the timeline concern in the language of measured caution rather than specific implication, would produce a record that felt like a contribution and would not produce the modification that the constraint required. He had made the decision before the briefing. The briefing had not changed it. He was going into the session with the honest version in the language that accurately conveyed it, and he was prepared for the specific quality of silence that honest versions produced in managed sessions. He was not, he would later understand, entirely prepared for the specific quality of what came after the silence. He gathered the session materials in the correct order, straightened the jacket that the Commission's formal dress code specified, and reviewed, in the final minute of the preparation suite's quiet, the specific sequence of the assessment as he had prepared it. The constraint, the evidence, the implication, the modification. 90 seconds, he estimated. Perhaps 100 if the modification required more precision to be legible to the room. He was ready. The session's convening signal came through the suite's communication panel. He picked up the materials and went. The grand hall of Sorvith Orin was the hall that it was, the accumulated weight of centuries of imperial administration made visible in a single space, which was the function that the grand hall had been built to perform, and which it performed with the thorough, patient efficiency of something that had been doing this for a very long time, and that had refined the doing into the architecture, rather than relying on any single occasion to carry the weight. Davin took the Commission's designated position in the session's formal arrangement, with the professional composure of someone who had been in significant rooms before, and who understood that the room's significance was real and required acknowledgement, and did not require performance. He acknowledged it and took his position, and reviewed the room with the strategic analyst's habit of understanding environments before operating in them. The Queen was at the session's formal authority position, the specific spatial arrangement that the hall's architecture had been designed to produce, which placed the Queen at the room's natural focal point without requiring any person or object to direct attention there, because the architecture had already directed it. Queen Thessavar had the quality that the formal portraits and the Commission's official documentation described with the institutional language of formal description. and that the official language's accuracy was. This was his first direct session in her presence, and he was calibrating, adequate in its factual elements and insufficient in its quality elements, which was the usual relationship between institutional language and actual persons. She was in the full, formal register of the session's authority position, which was not the same as being diminished by it. Some significant figures occupied formal positions the way that positions occupied them, as containers for a content that required the position's authority to be received. She occupied it as someone who carried the authority and the position in equal and separate measure, which was the specific quality of people who had been in significant positions long enough to become distinguishable from them. He noted this with the professional attention of someone who understood that the room's most important variable was always the decision-maker, and that understanding the decision-maker accurately was the precondition of useful analysis. The session opened with the formal sequence that the Velthari Strategic Council used for the agenda items that required full council deliberation. The senior council members addressed the Queen in the order of precedence, each delivering the assessment of the agenda item that their role and expertise produced. The order was hierarchical, which meant Daven's commission position came toward the session's close rather than its opening, which was appropriate, and which gave him the opportunity to hear what the preceding speakers brought to the item before adding the commission's contribution. He listened. The contributions were, he was assessing honestly, because honest assessment was the only kind his professional practice contained, substantive. The senior council members were capable, and their familiarity with the Empire's strategic situation was deep. And what they brought to the Eastern Corridor expansion question was the specific, granular understanding of people who had been working in this policy area for years and who had developed real knowledge of it. He was not going to dismiss the contributions because they did not say the thing he was going to say. They were good contributions. They were also contributions that had the specific quality he had identified in the Commission's preparation. They engaged with the proposal's positive elements thoroughly, and engaged with its constraints through the filter of language that managed the constraints' implications, rather than naming them directly. The technical appendix's footnote 23 did not appear in any of the contributions, which confirmed his pre-session assessment that the room had read the documentation for its formal claims, rather than for its qualified implications. The third speaker, Commander Vailth, the Council's senior military strategic officer, came closest to the constraint when she noted that the timeline would require careful coordination with the technical installation teams, and that contingency provisions should be considered for calibration delays. This was accurate as far as it went, and was, in the specific language of careful coordination and contingency provisions, the managed version of naming the 15-day calibration shortfall and its consequences for Subsector 4 during the historically highest-risk window. The room received this with the managed quality of a formal session, that is, hearing something it recognizes as a qualified concern, and that is waiting for the appropriate follow-up, which was the specific follow-up that would place the concern in the record without requiring it to be addressed in the session's deliberation. The follow-up was a formal notation that the session record would include the concern in the item's supplementary documentation, which was the institutional mechanism for honoring the mention of a concern while deferring its resolution to a subsequent process. Daven noted the notation and noted what it meant and continued attending to the session with the specific, patient attention of someone who was waiting for their position in the sequence. The session moved through 4 additional contributions after Commander Vailth, each of which engaged with the Eastern Corridor expansion in the mode the session had established. The room had the quality of a formal session that is proceeding correctly. The contributions were substantive, the deliberation was structured, the authority was present and attending. What was not present was the naming of the constraint. He was thinking about the 92nd when the Queen's formal invitation reached the Commission's position. Court Recorder Selveth announced the invitation in the formal session language. The Joint Commission was invited to offer its strategic assessment of the agenda item. The room had the specific, pre-contribution quality of a formal session between one speaker and the next, a momentary settling of the collective attention, the slight reorganization of the room's focus toward the position that was about to address it. He stood. He had the materials which he did not consult, because the assessment was prepared, and prepared assessments were prepared to be delivered rather than read. He looked at the Queen, because the Queen was the session's authority and addressing her was the correct formal orientation. She was looking at him with the complete, undistributed attention that he had noted as her specific quality. And the attention had the quality of someone who was genuinely receiving rather than formally receiving, which was the specific distinction that his 16 years had taught him to identify, because the difference between the two determined whether the assessment would be heard or simply processed. He began. He said, "The Commission's assessment of the Eastern Corridor monitoring expansion is that the proposal's strategic objectives are correct, and the proposed infrastructure configuration is sound, and that the proposed timeline has a specific technical constraint that the session's deliberation should address before the expansion proceeds." The room had the quality of a formal session that is receiving something slightly outside the expected register, not alarmed, not disrupted, but attending with the specific additional focus that the slightly unexpected produced. He continued, "The Eastern Corridor's subsurface monitoring arrays require a minimum 14 standard day calibration sequencing per installation tier. The proposed timeline accommodates 9-day sequencing. The shortfall is 5 days per tier across 3 tiers, producing a total calibration gap of 15 standard days. During this 15-day window, the monitoring infrastructure in Subsector 4 will be non-operational." He paused for the duration of a breath, because the pause was part of the structure, the moment that allowed the room to receive what it had just been told before the implication arrived. Subsector 4 is the highest risk zone in the Eastern Corridor for bilateral relationship incidents. The Commission's records document 7 of the past decade's 10 significant incidents as originating in or transiting through Subsector 4. The monitoring infrastructure in that subsector has been the primary early warning mechanism for 5 of those 7 incidents. A 15-day gap in that monitoring capability, during an expansion period that will require increased coordination activity in the corridor, represents a specific operational risk that the session should weigh against the timeline's advantages. Another breath. The Commission's recommendation is a timeline modification that extends the calibration sequencing to the minimum required protocol, 14 days per tier, and sequences the installation to maintain Subsector 4's monitoring capability continuously, beginning the Subsector 4 installation last rather than first. The extension adds approximately 15 standard days to the expansion's total timeline. The Commission's assessment is that the 15-day extension eliminates the specific operational risk the proposed timeline creates, and that the balance favors the extension. He stopped because the assessment was complete, and complete assessments did not require additional language. The hall was completely, immediately, structurally silent. Not the managed silence of a formal session between speakers. The specific, different silence of a room that has received something outside its operational grammar. And that is, in the first moment, in the specific processing mode of an institution that has heard a register, it was not prepared for, and that is waiting for its primary authority to determine how the register will be received. He had been in this silence before. Not in this hall, not with this authority, not with this specific configuration of 300 court members waiting for a signal that would tell them how to categorize what they had just heard. But the silence itself was the silence he had been in before, and the quality of it was familiar in the way of experiences that are uncomfortable, and that you have had enough times to understand without being comfortable in. He maintained his position with the professional composure of someone who had made a decision, and who was not revising the decision based on the silence, because the silence was the room's response to what he had said, and not a response to whether what he had said was accurate. The accuracy was in the documentation. The documentation was in the session's materials. The room could verify the accuracy at any time it chose to. He looked at the Queen. Queen Thesivar was looking at him with the complete, undistributed attention. It had not changed in quality from the moment he had begun the assessment. The same specific, full reception quality that he had identified as genuine reception rather than formal reception. What had changed was its character. It had acquired the additional layer of something that was not quite the assessment he had been expecting, which had been the formal authority's response to an unexpected register, and that was something more specific than that. He understood in the moment of looking at her directly across the formal distance of the audience hall, not deciding how to respond to his having said something unexpected. She was attending to what he had said, in the mode of someone who had received it and who was considering it, and who was, in the considering, producing the specific quality of attention that genuine consideration produced. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in a formal session of this significance was long enough to have the quality of a duration rather than a pause. Then she said, "Say it again." Not in the formal session's address register, not the institutional language of a sovereign directing a session's proceedings. In the direct, specific register of someone who has heard something and who wants to hear it again, and who is asking for the repetition in the language that asks rather than instructs. The room's silence produced, in the addition of the Queen's 3 words, a new quality. The specific, dense quality of a formal institution that has just watched its primary authority do something that the formal session's grammar had not included. He looked at her for a moment with the honest, receiving attention of someone who is making sure he understood the request accurately. "The assessment," he said. "What you said," she said, "from the beginning." He said it again. Not a modified version. Not the version that had processed the room's silence and the court's watching, and that had adjusted the register to be slightly more managed, and therefore more comfortable for the session's formal architecture. The same version in the same language at the same pace, because the language and the pace had been correct, and the assessment was the assessment, and accuracy was not a variable that adjusted to the observation conditions. He said, "The proposal's objectives were correct. The configuration was sound. The timeline had a specific technical constraint. He named the constraint. He stated the evidence. He identified the implication. He offered the modification." 97 seconds, the second time, because the second time he included a single additional sentence that he had omitted in the first delivery. The sentence that located the constraint in the technical appendix's specific location for any member of the session who wished to verify the accuracy directly. Footnote 23 of the technical appendix documents the calibration requirement and the proposed timeline's departure from it. He stopped. The hall's silence was different this time. The first silence had been the silence of an institution processing an unexpected register. This silence had the quality of something deeper, the silence of a room that has heard the same thing twice, and that has, in the hearing of it the second time, understood something that the first time had not fully resolved. The first time, the room had been processing the register. The second time, the room had been processing the content. There was a difference between those two processings, and the difference was what the silence's new quality expressed. He looked at the Queen. She was still looking at him, and the quality of her attention had resolved into something that was fully legible, not the processing quality of genuine consideration, but the settled quality of someone who has finished considering, and who is now in possession of what the considering produced. What she said, in the session's formal register, was directed to the full council rather than to him. The Commission's assessment identifies a specific technical constraint in the proposed timeline that the session's documentation supports. The session will note the constraint and the Commission's recommended modification. Senior Technical Coordinator Veth will prepare a formal response to the modification recommendation within 3 standard days, addressing the timeline adjustment's operational feasibility, and presenting the Council with a revised proposal that accommodates the minimum calibration protocol. She paused. The session will hold the Eastern Corridor expansion item pending the coordinator's response. The expansion proceeds on the modified timeline if the coordinator's response confirms the feasibility. The session reconvenes for deliberation if it does not. Court Recorder Selveth annotated the session record with the specific efficiency of someone whose role was the accurate capture of session decisions, and who was, in this specific moment, capturing something that the session record would not have contained under the proposed timeline's original version. The Council received the directive with the formal composure of an institution that has received instruction from its primary authority, and that is processing the instruction in the mode of compliance, acknowledging, noting, adjusting. Some members of the Council were in the specific mode of compliance that included a secondary processing layer, which was the layer that was also assessing what had just occurred beyond the immediate content of the directive. He could identify these members by the specific quality of their formal composure, which was performing compliance while the secondary layer ran. He was aware that his position in the room had changed in the specific way that positions change in formal settings when the primary authority has publicly engaged with their contribution in a manner that could not be interpreted as neutral. He was also aware that the change was not yet, and possibly not ever, the change of institutional acceptance, which was a different and longer process. It was the change of a moment that had been witnessed, and that had produced a recorded outcome, which was the kind of change that formal sessions produced, and that was therefore legible to the court in a way that informal assessments were not. The session continued through its remaining items with the quality of a formal session that has had one significant departure from the expected sequence, and that has returned, with the institutional composure that such sessions develop, to its normal operating rhythm. Davin attended the remaining items with the professional focus of someone doing their job, and noted the session's content accurately, and contributed to one additional item, a minor commission procedural question, with the measured, appropriate register that the item warranted. The session closed at the formal time with the formal closing language of the Velthari Strategic Council's session protocol, and the court began the dispersal process that formal sessions produced. The organized, unhurried dispersal of 300 significant people from a significant room in the specific sequence that their precedents and their subsequent obligations produced. He was collecting the session materials from the Commission's position when Court Recorder Selveth approached with the formal efficiency of someone on an errand rather than a visit. The Queen requests a brief exchange with the Commission representative, Selveth said, in the specific, neutral language of someone conveying a message accurately. The Council's secondary hall, when the formal dispersal has completed. He confirmed the request and continued organizing the materials while the dispersal completed around him, which it did in the approximately 12 minutes that the formal session's dispersal protocol required for a council of this composition. The secondary hall was the working room adjacent to the grand hall, the room that the Commission's documentation identified as the Queen's preference for the kind of exchange that was neither fully formal nor fully informal, which was the kind that the secondary hall's specific spatial qualities accommodated. Smaller than the grand hall, unoptimized for ceremony, with the quality of a room that was used rather than displayed. He arrived at the secondary hall before the Queen, which was the correct protocol for this category of exchange. The requesting party waited. He organized his composure with the specific attention of someone who had been in a significant session and who was now moving into a different register of significant encounter, and who understood that the different register required a different quality of presence than the session's formal one. The Queen arrived without the full formal attendant complement. 2 attendants, the minimum for the secondary hall's protocol, who positioned themselves at the room's margins with the professional invisibility of people who were present and not in the conversation simultaneously. She did not sit. He did not sit. The exchange was standing, which was the register of something brief and direct, and which was, he understood, a choice. She looked at him with the same complete, undistributed attention as the session, and in the secondary hall's smaller and more specific space, the quality of that attention was more immediate than it had been across the grand hall's formal distance. "You said it again in the same way," she said. "Yes," he said. "I asked you to repeat it," she said, "because I wanted to see if you would." He looked at her steadily. "I understood that," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Most people, when asked to repeat something they said that produced that quality of silence, produce a modified version, a version that preserves the content but adjusts the register towards something more comfortable. She paused. "You repeated it exactly. The assessment was accurate the first time," he said. "Adjusting the register to make it more comfortable would have made it less accurate, because the register was part of the accuracy. The constraint is significant, and the language that names significant things in the measured register of things that are merely worth noting communicates the wrong weight." She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who has received something and is holding it. "The court does not receive direct assessments in formal sessions," she said. "This is not a rule. It is the outcome of the incentive structure the court has developed, in which the cost of direct assessment is uncertain, and the cost of managed assessment is predictable. Predictable costs are preferred over uncertain ones." "I understand the structure," he said. "I've worked in similar structures for 16 years, and you continue to give direct assessments," she said. "The managed version produces worse outcomes," he said, "consistently. The short-term cost of the uncertainty is lower than the long-term cost of the inaccuracy." She looked at him for a moment with the specific, evaluative quality that he had been tracking in the session, the quality of someone who was assessing not the content of what he was saying, but the thing the content was an expression of. "Footnote 23, she said. "Yes," he said. "No one in the council read it at the level of its implication," she said. "Not in today's preparation," he said. Commander Vailth had identified the general area of the constraint, the careful coordination language, and the contingency provisions. The specific implication of Subsector 4's monitoring gap may or may not have been in her preparation. It wasn't in her contribution. "Why not?" she said. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not the question of someone who already had an answer and was testing whether his answer matched. The genuine question of someone who was actually asking. He thought about it honestly. "Because the specific implication is uncomfortable," he said. "The expansion is a priority. Naming a constraint that modifies the timeline produces resistance. The managed version, noting the concern in general terms and placing the specifics in the supplementary documentation, honors the constraint without requiring the session to engage with it. The incentive is toward the managed version. And you don't use the managed version," she said. not when the specific implication is significant enough to affect the outcome, he said. In this case, a 15-day monitoring gap in subsector 4 during a high-activity expansion period is significant enough that the managed version would have produced a session record that contained the concern and a project that proceeded with the risk unaddressed. She was quiet again, and the quiet had the specific quality of the session's second silence, the quality of a room that has heard something twice and that has, in the second hearing, understood it. The council will have opinions about today's session, she said. Probably, he said. Several of them will be unfavorable opinions about the commission's representative, she said. It was flat and accurate, in the mode of someone delivering information rather than the mode of someone managing the information's impact on its recipient. That's a predictable outcome of the incentive structure, he said. The managed version is what the structure rewards. The direct version is what the structure penalizes. The council's unfavorable opinions are the structure working correctly. She held his gaze for a long moment, and in the long moment he was aware of the secondary hall and its specific qualities, the smaller scale, the working room quality, the two attendants at the margins performing their professional invisibility, and he was aware of the complete, undistributed attention as it had been throughout the session, and as it was now in this distance, which was the distance of a conversation rather than a formal session, and which was therefore more immediate in the specific way of things experienced without the mediating grammar of the formal register. I asked for the repetition, she said, because the session needed to hear it twice, not because I hadn't heard it the first time. She paused. The first time the room was processing the register. The second time the room processed the content. The content required processing. Another pause. The modification will be in the revised proposal. The Commission's footnote 23 will be in the session record. I know, he said. I heard the directive. I want you to know, she said, that the footnote will not be the only thing in the session record from today. He looked at her. What else? The record will include, she said, with the specific, careful precision of someone who was choosing language for a purpose, that the Commission's representative identified a specific technical constraint that the session's preceding contributions had not named, and that the identification produced a session outcome that addressed the constraint. She paused. This is accurate. It will be in the record because it is accurate and because the record should be accurate. He was quiet for a moment, in the specific quiet of someone who has received something and who is receiving it honestly rather than managing the receiving. Thank you, he said. I should be thanking you, she said. The constraint is real. The modification is correct. The session would have produced an outcome that proceeded with the risk unaddressed if the constraint had remained in the supplementary documentation. The constraint was in the documentation, he said. It needed someone to move it from the documentation to the deliberation. Yes, she said, it did. She looked at him steadily. The court's strategic sessions will benefit from the Commission's representative continuing to do exactly that. He understood what she was saying. Not a formal commission to a new role, not an institutional directive. The specific, direct communication of someone who had made an assessment and who was sharing the assessment in the register it required, which was the quiet, specific register of something said because it was true. He gave her the honest response that the honesty of the communication warranted. I'll continue to read the footnotes. The corner of her mouth moved in the specific way of something that was not a smile and was adjacent to one, the expression of someone who has received a response, that is exactly what the response needed to be and who is, in the receiving of it, finding it worth something. Good, she said. The session record will reflect that the Commission's assessment was specific, accurate, and actionable. The Council will read the record. She paused. Some of them will find that reading useful for their own approach to future sessions. And some of them won't, he said. And some of them won't, she confirmed. That is also how it goes. She gave him the small, specific nod of someone concluding an exchange that had been what it needed to be. The coordinator's response in 3 days. The commission will receive a copy. He confirmed that the commission would receive it and gathered the session materials and thanked her for the exchange in the formal language that the secondary hall's protocol required, and she acknowledged with the formal language that the role required, and the exchange was complete. He walked back through the corridor toward the commission's transit section with the materials and the session record, and the specific, clear quality of someone who had said what they actually thought in a formal session, and who had, in the aftermath of it, found that the aftermath contained things he had not expected. Not the absence of consequences. The consequences were real, and the council's unfavorable opinions were predictable and accurate and would require management. But alongside the consequences, and produced by the same session, the specific, direct communication of a primary authority who had asked for the repetition not because she had missed the first version, but because she had understood that the room needed to hear it twice, which was the kind of assessment that only someone who had genuinely received the first version could have made. He thought about this on the transit back. He thought about it in the specific, honest mode of someone who was building the category for what had occurred rather than fitting it into an existing one, because the existing categories were inadequate. The category he was building was something about the difference between the institutions that hired you for honesty and struggled when they received it, and the specific, rare configuration of a decision-maker who understood, not as a performance, not as a stated value, but as the operational reality of someone who had been receiving managed assessments for long enough to recognize their specific limitations, that the direct version was worth the uncertainty of its reception. He would write the session notation in the commission's formal record when he arrived. He would write it accurately, in the language that accurately conveyed what had occurred. He thought that was probably the only way he knew how to do things, which was why he had said what he had said, and which was, apparently, why he had been asked to say it again.